Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this special event of the John Adams Institute with Abhijit Banerjee. Abhijit is going to... Actually, Abhijit and Esther are now in Paris, and we had desperately hoped that they would be willing to come up to Amsterdam and do this event in person. But I think given the stringent new rules about Corona, we all understand that they didn't really feel free to travel. So we're glad that he's joining us online this evening together with you. He's here to talk about his book, Good Economics for Hard Times. And he has just a few days left, together with Esther, to be the most recent current Nobel Prize winner for economics, because next Monday, just before noon, the new winner of 2020 will be announced. The actual conversation will be conducted by our moderators of this evening. I'd like to introduce them to you. Esther van Rijswijk, herself an economist, and seconded by Jasper Lucazen, who is the editor-in-chief, and pass them on to our moderators. You can go to the link on our website. The website is www.john-adams.nl, and check and click on the link in our website, and then you'll come to our YouTube page, and in there you can type your questions, and I'm here waiting for them, and I'll be posing some of your questions in the course of our conversation this evening. So I would like to invite you to take the floor.
Yes, thank you so much, Tracy, and welcome to everybody at home watching us, and welcome to those people here in the room, and welcome to Jasper. And let me tell you a little bit about how Jasper and I started together, because we have been doing this before, interviewing economists. Jasper called me when Corona just broke, and he said, what's happening? We have to do something. We have to do something with economists, and they will be thinking all these questions and wondering what to do as well. So we did a series of interviews online on Zoom, like everybody was working at that moment in the first half of this year, or in the months after the lockdown in March started. And it was great. Actually, we really liked working together. So when I was very happy that Tracy called me to do this interview tonight, I said I want to bring Jasper. Yes. So I'm proudly presenting Jasper Lucazen, as Tracy just said, the editor-in-chief of ASB.
Now, I have the feeling this is too much about me. We should talk about
That's definitely what we should talk about, and that's why I'm already turning to you, because tell us about our guest of tonight, and what did he exactly win the Nobel Prize for, and why are we so happy to talk to him?
Yeah, so he won the Nobel Prize for figuring out how to do development cooperation, development aid properly. So usually we used to think about when we measure output. So we distribute books to schools in low-income countries. This is an output measure, whether this, then we used to think this would improve schooling. Now he said, no, we have to work on outcome, so whether children actually learn better as a result of that. And we have to do that in a way, and we have to measure that in a way that we can rule out all kinds of other factors. So half of randomly selected schools get free books, the other half of randomly selected schools do not get free books. And then after a couple of years, you measure whether the children have learned more.
Yeah, which was totally new, and that may be surprising to some of you, but up until then we were just counting the books that were given to children, basically,
yes,
weren't
and
we?
It turned out giving books doesn't work.
It doesn't?
It doesn't, but other things do really work, and worked surprisingly better than was anticipated before. So as a result of this research, which he got the Nobel Prize jointly with Esther Duflo and Michael Kramer, and they found out, for example, that microfinance didn't work as well as anticipated.
That's another thing that may surprise a lot of people. So giving books to children does not necessarily work. Microfinance does not necessarily work.
But quality of teachers does work. And mosquito nets against malaria does work.
Okay.
And getting rid of these small worms in children does work too.
Yeah. And before we talk too much about him, let's go to him. Yeah. Are you there, Mr. Banerjee? There you are. a warm welcome.
Excellent. Thank you.
Excellent. Did you get that introduction that we were?
Yes, I did. It was very generous. Thank you. And
Okay, we just picked some of the examples that people might be surprised about that you researched. It's all microeconomics. I myself am a macroeconomic, and the microeconomists, and especially you and your wife, and Mr. Kramer, started to really do the important nitty-gritty work to figure out what all the other theorists hoped would work. So, and that you, I think, rightfully got the Nobel Prize for. Yeah. We would like to give you the floor. You prepared a small introduction for about 10 minutes, I think. So the floor is yours. Go ahead.
thank you. So I'm very grateful to be invited to this forum, especially because our new book, Good Economics for Hard Times, is, I guess, being released now in Dutch. And I wanted to say a few words about what the ambition of the book was. It's a book with many pages and many arguments, so I won't try to summarize it, but just give you a flavor of what motivated us to write the book. But I mean, you might have noticed that kind of the world, even before COVID, was in a little bit of a mess. There was I think the increasingly evident fact that there's the environmental crisis was looming, that we were kind of, with all the good intentions being expressed by all sides, we were still kind of sidling into a major environmental crisis, and we're still heading there, to be, I'm afraid, if we don't do something more drastic than we have done. Inequality has been rising everywhere, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, dramatically, and with, I think, dramatic consequences but also elsewhere, the set of people who feel that somehow they're being cheated by the market economy has been growing, and you see that discontent in this, the rise of a political right that's economically statist. That's you hear that flavor everywhere. You hear it in the US, in France, many other, in a sense, even in the developing world, you start to see more and more statist. With that, we have that sort of goes with it. There is a kind of a general resentment of the sort of free trade, the US taking the lead in that, the US being for many years the kind of world champion of free trade, increasingly becoming, as well, it's been for a while, maybe even from the 90s, but now being kind of really radically anti-interventionist in trade. We have the whole anti-migrant, both the crises in Syria, in parts of Africa, partly related to climate change, the many droughts, people trying to find their way to somewhere, and then in the middle of that, they're finding that the somewhere they want to go to doesn't want them. So I think I think when we started writing this book, it was about a sense of foreboding, which I think was, alas, too accurate in a sense. We see now the world in full-blown crisis, but I think the sense of foreboding was somehow there, and with that, it was this other fact that really troubled us, which is that many of these issues, well, I've spoken about inequality, about trade, about immigration, about the environment, and all of these are economic issues, obviously. They might also be political issues, they're all also social issues, but you cannot sort of speak of them without taking economics seriously. And yet, as economists, maybe this is not true in the Netherlands. I hope it's not true in the Netherlands, that they take you guys more seriously than they take us. But I know that in the US, we did a poll of 10,000 people, and in that poll of 10,000 people, this was roughly representative. It's a little bit hard to get into representative online polls because, the 85-year-olds don't so much go in online polls, but still we did pretty good job of getting it to representative. And in that poll, what was very, very clear is that if you get people to say, who do you trust about their area of specialization? So nurses are trusted about nursing. Doctors are trusted about being a doctor. Accountants are trusted about accounting. The rock bottom, maybe this won't surprise you, I think it's unfortunate and unfair, are politicians. But the next are economists. 20% trust economists, 80% don't. Not about poetry, about economics. So don't trust economists about economics. So somehow we were missing the bus. And this is a bus that is very costly to miss. It's a bus that is, it's about all the issues that I think we as economists are passionate about. They're all about all the issues that the world really needs to grapple with, and we do actually know something about, and yet we are sort of off the bus. So the ambition in the book was how to get back on the bus. And I think in part, I think there is something not entirely unfair about the criticism of economics. Economics, for a long time, functioned as if, if the world doesn't cooperate with the models, then the world is wrong. And I think that attitude did some damage. We still, I think, do lots of, for example, we are constantly predicting things, and we are pretty lousy at it. As somebody pointed out, if the International Monetary Fund, it makes an annual prediction of the growth in the world in the coming year, and roughly, if it always said 3%, it wouldn't do any worse than the predictions. So it does predictions about as wrong as they would be if you just said 3%, 3%, 3%, 3%, 3%. They would be wrong, but not more wrong than they are. So that's an example of what we do and how we undermine credibility. That said, what makes it doubly unfortunate is that, in fact, the field of economics has, for the last 25 years, been moving away from sort of making blanket pronouncements, the sort of thing that Esther was mentioning about the work we do, and Jasper was mentioning the work that we do that is much more specific on specific questions, not general statements of principle, but specific questions, not that you should have the lowest taxes possible, but that because taxes destroy incentives, but that, taxes, how much incentives do taxes destroy? Are they really damaging, or can we really afford to raise taxes a lot more without doing damage? Asking the specific question. So I think a lot of the practice in economics, if you see who are the people who are really leading the field, I think a lot of those people are doing work that's both, I think, sensible and useful. However, part of the problem, I think, is most of us don't like speaking to the public. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work trying to explain what we do. And it's much easier to speak to each other. We understand each other very well. Our language is beautifully tailored to speak to each other and not very well tailored to speak to anyone else. So we speak to each other. And I think that's part. And of course, there are people on TV who speak as economists, but many of those people are actually not economists. They work for banks, they work for financial companies, they work for other organizations, but they speak as economists, and their view of economics is both sometimes dated because they stopped doing economics a while ago, and often motivated as well because they have some axe to grind. So I think we get a lot of bad press for economics that is actually not the current best practice in economics. That's part of what we felt. So then the question is, what do you do about it? And we thought, well, we have to write a book. And what kind of book? Well, I think the one attempt we make, and you'll have to, when you read it, you'll have to judge whether we succeed or not, is to avoid two possible errors. One is speak in the language of economies, avoid normal language. So we write as far as possible in normal language. We really try to avoid any jargon. The other side of it is then there's a temptation to oversimplify. I think we also wanted to keep the arguments at the level of sophistication they deserve, because I think people are skeptical of what economists say, not because they are inherently incapable of understanding, but because when we speak, we pronounce too much. We have a sort of oracular style. We say, growth will be 3%, and then usually it's not, but whatever we pronounce. And rather than explaining what we can say, what we can't say, what is uncertain, what is we have more confidence in, why we have the confidence, what's the logic behind it. So it was an attempt to write a book which is both, at least in its ambition, at the level of seriousness that the literature demands, that explanations are sophisticated, they pay respect to the intelligence of the reader, but on the other hand, avoid the unnecessary technicality. So that was the ambition of the book. I'm going to stop here, but I hope some of you at least will read the book and see if you believe.
Thank you so much. Well, let's show the book then. We don't have it here at the moment, but we have this picture of it. Can we please? So this is the. Oh, this is you and your wife actually.
That's not a book.
And yeah, the next one. This is the book. And I think, Jasper, you wanted to say something about the title, didn't you?
Yes.
Please translate for Mr. Banerjee the Dutch title,
so
which is quite
first
different.
The English title for the audience, Good Economics for Hard Times. Now the Dutch title is a bit more active. It's Hoe economie de wereld kan redden, translated How Economics Can Save the World. And that's a bit more ambitious, I'd say.
Yeah.
Can we go back to Mr. Banerjee on the screen?
A year later. So has your thinking changed in the past year?
Not at the level of this book. I think everything in the book, I would say, more or less, I would stand by. But in a sense, the debates in the book keep coming back. There's a lot of, for example, this issue of whether or not if you redistribute more to poor people, they become lazy and they stop working, and the US is kind of frozen by that idea because the Republicans have been very worried about, the incentive effects of these giveaways or whatever, these social support programs, what they call giveaways and what I would call social support programs. And so that issue, which is something we give a lot of prominence in the book, keeps coming back, and with major consequences. The US is now, I think, tipping back into a recession that they could have avoided because they can't agree on a new set of social support payments, and part of the reason is people are so worried about how this is going to become. It's going to undermine all effort. In fact, there are 6 or 7 studies of social support programs carried out in the US and in Europe just in the last 6 months. And none of them find that these have been, reducing people's, willingness to take a job. In fact, even in cases where they were paid more than the job, they were keen to hold on to the job. because they knew these payments are not coming back. So there's nothing surprising there. But there's absolutely no reason to take the kind of this ideological view that that if you give people money, they're going to immediately fold their hands and look at the ceiling. I just think this is it's an example of something we tried to kill in our book. We obviously failed, but it's an idea. It's an idea that has so much influence in the world. This idea.
Why do you say you obviously failed?
Well, I mean, the Republicans in the US...
They aren't listening.
They haven't read the book, or they're not listening.
Okay. So in the book, you say that some economists, you don't, the audience, the people don't trust them. The ones in the media, maybe they shouldn't even trust them, so they're right there. But would you say the book is an attempt to regain trust for economists?
Yes, that's a very nice way to put it. Okay. It's a way to regain trust by giving away a little bit, to say that, look, we aren't always right. We don't know everything. We're not always, all-knowing. Our pronouncements often are off point, but at least this is the reason why this is hard. So it's to regain trust by partly not claiming to be as wise as we often do.
Okay. I'm going to ask the technicians to switch to picture number 5, slide number 5, and I hope you can see it too, Mr. Banerjee. It's this one.
I don't see it.
You don't see it. It's a big shark mouth.
Okay.
You probably know why I chose that one.
Yes.
Can you explain? And then we can switch back to Mr. Banerjee. Because one of the chapters in the book is about the mouth of the shark, and it's a topic you already mentioned.
It's derived from a wonderful poem that I would encourage all of you to read by a Somali British poet, Warsan Shire, and the key line there is. Let me not quote because I've misquote, but I think the idea there is that people leave home because they're running from the mouth of the shark. People don't so much migrate. In fact, economists for many years have been worrying about the opposite of what people usually think is the issue, which is people think hordes of people are leaving their homes and always going for economic opportunity. In the meanwhile, one of the earlier 1976 Nobel Prize winner, Arthur Lewis, pointed out, and it's since been many times reinforced, that the puzzle is often why people don't migrate more. They seem to live on very little. And the existence is precarious. The jobs in elsewhere are often much more paying within the same country. Within the US, you see people who are, the rate of migration between rural areas and urban areas has actually halved since the 1950s. Or it's in a sense, people are, that's not quite right, but it's, I should say the exact statement is a bit more detailed than that, but basically people don't leave their county anymore. This is at the county level. People used to, the rate at which people left their counties to go to a different county within a year has halved since the 1950s. So the puzzle is often why people don't move when there are no economic opportunities for them at home. And the poem is making the point that, in fact, people leave home when somebody's coming after them. It's civil war, it's environmental disasters. That's what pushes people out. People leave Africa right now, not from the poorest places. They're not so much living Liberia. They're living Libya, which is a much less poor country, because Libya is in the middle of a civil war. They're living other places where there is just large environmental disasters. So it's very much the case that people is the mouth of the shark that's coming after you that makes you leave home, and not so much the temptation of the great riches. Of course, some people leave to make a better living, but on average, this is actually relatively small, and economists have been puzzled by why it isn't more than it is, in a sense.
Difficult to leave your home, right? It costs a lot of resources. You leave your social networks behind. You leave friends and family, and it's an uncertain adventure.
Unless you're a 20-year or 25-year-old male. That's...
Even those people, they don't leave. I mean, that's the striking factor, that even if you take the people who are in the US, the migration rate has fallen most, I think, for the young.
That's one of the things you do in the book. You say there's all these misconceptions, and economists, if they dive into the data and do their work properly, they can take those away. And this is one of them. Another one is on, and it's a very important debate, obviously, in the United States. Another thing is that tariffs on Chinese steel may cause American farm workers to lose their jobs. Or that's actually the misconception, is that tariffs will protect jobs. But you're saying they don't. And we have a picture on that. That would be number 6. I'll explain to Mr. Banerjee what we see on this slide number 6. It's basically Mr. Trump sitting in between steel workers and signing of a bill to raise the tariffs on Chinese steel. So let's go back to Mr. Banerjee. So this concept, this idea, American workers will lose their jobs, so we should just raise the tariffs. Is it that simple?
Well, yeah, exactly. So I think that what is true is that you could protect some jobs in steel. I don't think that's the question is what then happens, because of course, if for example, this actually successful and the Chinese currency depreciates as a result of that, because China can't export as much to the US, well, the Chinese are going to not have money to buy farm products from the US either. Then there is the additional problem that the Chinese probably going to react to the US tariffs by putting their own tariffs on US, and they did. They were blocking US soybeans. So I think that the idea that tariffs are going to sort of unilaterally, you'll be able to put tariffs, and that's just going to make your steel workers better off without hurting anybody else, seems goes against all the literature in trade, and I think it's highly implausible. Now that said, it's important to say that steel workers in the US do lose when tariffs are lowered. It's not. I think one of the points we make in the book is economists have been too willing to say there's only winners from trade. There's tons of losers from trade, tons and tons of losers. The claim that economists made, my late colleague Paul Samuelson famously explained, was not that trade makes everyone better off, but that trade makes everyone better off if we take the trouble to redistribute from the winners to the losers. And then, of course, that last part of it is conveniently forgotten. And I think that's one of the places where I totally blame the economics profession. Yeah. We haven't done a good job of just militating for doing a better job of compensating losers.
And is that I'll be with Tracy in a bit because there's questions coming in, but I have here a policy economist with me. So are you saying that economists didn't advise the right policy, or are you saying that politicians ignored it?
I think economists didn't stand up. The economists are too willing to always howl when there is some, violation of free trade, but they don't howl when for example, the US has this trade adjustment allowance, which is a policy designed to compensate the losers. In fact, the counties that are most affected by trade per capita get 23 cents from that program. It means nothing. it's a program that doesn't do anything. Economists don't seem to be so concerned about that. They're very concerned whenever trade is.
It's slowly changing the profession.
Are we becoming more interested in the losers?
Well, we're becoming more interested in equitability, in sharing things, because we are in a more interconnected society. So we find out that as a society we don't do that well if there's some people doing very badly in certain places in our society.
Okay.
And this insight is slowly creeping up into the economics profession.
Okay, let me move to Tracy, because you are getting questions from
I think
the
we have an
audience.
interesting, relevant question here. One of our listeners asked you, Professor Banerjee, are you an activist? Can you, as an academic, also be an activist? How do you see yourself?
I guess I would say I'm a small-time activist in the sense that I'm in fact the chair of the Coronavirus Response Committee for the state of West Bengal in India. The state of West Bengal in India is not small. There are 90 million people in West Bengal, and I actually I'm the chair of the advisory committee for that. So that makes me, I guess, a small-time activist. I don't see any shame in being an activist. It's not that sometimes it does create conflicts because, as an academic, I tend to want to stick to very, very, very carefully documented facts. As someone who's involved in policy, sometimes you have to say, well, I don't have the best possible evidence, but it looks like everybody's saying that ventilation is good, so let's go with ventilation. So there is some tension there. It's not an entirely free. You pay a cost for it, but I'm okay with paying that cost sometimes.
Some might say that with the knowledge that you have, that it's your moral duty to be an activist, but that's what some might say.
I would accept that. I could be more of an activist, but there's also some. In some ways, we are activists within the economics profession. We've sort of hopefully a little bit changed it into our work by insisting on relevance, on doing work that does affect policy. That's we set up an organization called the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab.
One of our questions from the audience was to just say a few words about what the Poverty Action Lab does.
Right. So Poverty Action, we set it up 17 years ago with the idea that hard evidence should inform policy, and in particular to encourage the economics profession to produce hard evidence by doing randomized controlled trials of policies, and then encouraging the policy world to give some weight and credence to what we learned from those randomized controlled trials, to not treat all evidence as being equally suspicious, that put some faith, inject some faith into what we think is better evidence. So that was the agenda. That's why we set up the Poverty Action Lab. And it has been, I would say, quite successful. We've done more than 1,000 randomized controlled trials in 80-something countries. And in some important ways, we have managed to shift policies in important directions.
What would be your personal favorite top 3 of lessons learned from this lab? Or am I trying too much to generalize lessons now? Maybe that's not possible.
I think I can try to answer that question. So I think that I'm going to give you general lessons. One is details matter. This is sort of the point that Jasper was making before, which is about the textbooks. Details matter. It's not a matter of education is good. This is maybe true, but it's for a policymaker, it's mostly an empty statement. What does that mean? I build school buildings? Do I buy textbooks? Do I paint the walls in the schools. What does that actually mean? So it's the level at which policymakers act. That's where the details live. They have to think about how to spend money on, and there are many heads you could spend money. You could hire more expensive teachers. You could train them differently. You could organize different forms of pedagogy. You could paint the walls as well, or build a nice new building. So what's the best use of the money? I think that's a question that is an example of a question that drives on details. So number one, details matter. Number two, we can be, I think, we're often too inclined to put weight on financial incentives. People, as we were discussing in the case of migration, people stay home because they're going to miss their family. They're going to feel sad. There are all kinds of things that we tend to be too skeptical of, and I think a lot of where we often see that when you offer people very strong and clear incentives, even then the responses are quite weak. And I think it's worth understanding why. And I think one of the lessons. And the third thing I would say is that I think we at our peril ignore what people tell us. There's a lot of that's one of the themes in our previous book, Poor Economics, was that, which is that there's lots of things which, if you ask somebody a question, I'm going to go back to the microfinance example. You ask somebody, what would you want your child to do in a developing country? It's very rare to find somebody who says, I want him to be a small-time entrepreneur. The usual answer is, I want him to have a government job, or I want him to have a steady job or something. Whereas I think when microfinance came with the message that everybody is just raring to be an entrepreneur, we should have been more skeptical, because you don't actually hear it. So I think we need to be more. If we just listen to what people say, we would actually be often a little bit less prone to mistakes. I'll give you another example. I think we've been going back to the trade question. We have somehow managed to ignore this fact that people somehow are extraordinarily anti-free trade. Tons of people, despite even people who are on the political right, don't like free trade. And I think the idea that this is all because people are confused, I think is a mistake. I think you should listen to what they're saying. They're saying, look, I don't care about what's happening. Maybe free trade will let all the others gain. They'll buy cell phones for $5 less, but I'm going to lose my entire livelihood. This is my life, and we'll lose it. I hate that. I think they're saying something important there. So I do feel that just this act of being a bit more responsive to people's reactions is often very, very educative.
And they're worried.
And then we discover things that we should have discovered before.
Okay. I'm going to ask Jasper a question, because you can maybe explain to us a bit how important all these insights, Poor Economics, you brought a book. You said it was one of your favorites when you were studying. And also the new book, well, the Nobel Prize. But how does it influence the whole science of economics?
Well, it changes the way economists look at their own field, but it also changes the usefulness of economists for the world at large. Instead of, let's say, making the caricature of the economist that says economic growth will be 2%, you come up with actual advice with which you can do something. So that's useful. Plus, when studying things in more detail, you become a bit more humble, and you can always explain better what's going on, and this better understanding then you hope that the world takes this up and develops in a better way. So this is let's say kind of a scientific revolution in economics. It's important.
Yeah, and as a policy economist, you were a big fan of the first book. How about the second book? Because I think it gives us less instruments to.
Yeah, it gives more insights and
it's more insights, but
so in my view, if you dislike economics because you dislike the way economists think, then you may be very pleasantly surprised by Good Economics for Hard Times, because it will not tell you what to think. It'll just give you insights about how things work when you look closer in the world, and that's very useful. But it isn't useful for policy per se. So
as a policymaker, what do you? When we read the book, we won't know how to proceed, or will we?
No, but I don't think this book is. But
no,
you
that's not what it's written for. Mr. Banerjee, what do you want policymakers to do with it? For example, the chapter on migration, it tells us all the misconceptions we have, and we just discussed those, but we still don't know what to do.
And let me push back a little bit. Jasper is very kind, but I still think that I think towards the end of the book we are more prescriptive.
Yeah.
In particular, I think
taxes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure.
I think we have very clear position that we need taxes to be higher, welfare to be more generous and more responsive, and more sort of sensitive to the dignity of the people who are benefiting from it. We should be less judgmental about them and more see them as co-partners in this market economy, which is often going to just hit people with shocks that often not of their making. But that doesn't mean we should get rid of the market economy. We should treat it as this is the collateral damage from it, and that this is what we will have to do to make the market economy less painful for people. So we emphasize a lot the importance of creating new jobs, new livelihoods. We spell it out in some detail.
Yeah.
And that's one place where we are quite specific.
I agree. And this is, but raising taxes, I mean, that's a totally different issue, I think, in the US than it would be in Europe, in France, where you are now, or in the Netherlands. Is there something we can say about the level of taxes in Europe?
Yeah,
so I think that I think you're making a good point. I mean, if you look at even for France, I think the numbers that people like Emmanuel Saez and his co-authors have come up with, the wealth tax is a key piece of what they are recommending. So I think something like a 2 to 3% wealth tax is not at all unreasonable.
Yeah,
for
Europe.
For Europe, so I would say less income taxes, but more on wealth taxes.
Yep.
Wealth tax, France has basically got rid of wealth taxation in recent years, and that doesn't seem like the right direction.
I would recommend everybody to read the book. I've got a couple of other misconceptions here that we could talk about that the book quite well explains. But I think I want to go, unless Jasper intervenes here and there's a misconception you want to dive into. We've mentioned the word modest. The word micro also is kind of in this same group of it's tiny, it's modest, it's... and I think the way you speak and your wife speaks, we could say, is with, well, you don't make yourself bigger than you are. And that's also where some of the criticism comes from. Because some people say, well, but we should get rid of the market economy. We should get rid of free trade. The biggest problem is capitalism. And that's what you should be talking or writing about. We won't solve the problems in the world if we just do all those tiny little things. What do you say to those people?
I mean, I am always willing to be persuaded that we have a entirely different economic system available, but I would say the historical record is a bit depressing on that. So I'm willing to be engaged, but I feel like state ownership of businesses has not been a resounding success so far. So this is not to say that the current form of capitalism is in good shape. I think it's in bad shape, actually. One of the points we make in the book is that you see in a kind of a slowing down of productivity growth, despite all this kind of this hype about, innovation and disruption and this and that. Productivity growth is really slow now. I mean, and part of the reason it might be slow is that we have very large monopolies dominating everything.
So that's a way of saying we need more capitalism instead of less.
Yeah, but we need less monopoly capitalism than we have now. I think we need more aggressive young firms who are innovating and somehow protect them from being eaten up by the big players. I think that's a place where we see very it's in a sense where capitalism right now is nowhere near the classical ideals of capitalism. Yeah. It's a very monopolized.
I can follow you to a large extent, but where should the change come from? Should we change the role of the government such that the market then changes? Should we change the rules of the game, or should we convince firms that they should do differently, or should the consumers take the lead? Households?
I'm sufficiently old-fashioned to think that the government needs to step in. I don't think anybody else has the power to regulate these massive companies, and I think I think they are extremely good at deflecting all criticism. When you think of what Facebook is continuing to do, I would say so. It's not it is not easy to imagine that consumer groups are going to be sufficiently powerful. I do think that there is some value to old-fashioned regulation in this context.
Let's give the last word, of course, to the audience. Tracy.
Yes, we have a couple interesting questions. One of them is about the current situation in the US, where we see that there was a stimulus package for the first wave of corona. Now the government is finally starting to move on a second stimulus package. We see a wave of evictions starting in the US as protection from being evicted has passed. Will these stimulus, yes, they're necessary in the short run, but what would really help structurally now that we see the economy in so many countries, also in India, being devastated by the virus? We have a series of incidents now. What's the structure?
That's a good question. I think that I would say the answer for the US and for India might be different. So I think for a country like India, I think the mechanisms of targeting are very weak. So if you really want to protect people, you need to have something like an access to a universal income. May not be everybody receiving it, but at least everybody having, wherever they are, having the option of claiming it. I think that some version of that is probably the only way you're going to protect people extensively. In the US, I feel that we can do better than that, meaning that has the downside that we, of course, give little bit of money to lots of people. And I think in the US, we could do better in the sense that we could give more money to fewer people, the people who really need it, because we actually have the information often. We could have predicted which industries will collapse with Chinese competition. We could have protected those people ahead of time. In fact, we knew exactly what's happening. We let it happen, but it's not that. So in some sense, I think we could be more proactive in identifying who are the losers in a country like the US.
As we speak, a news alert comes in from the New York Times. President Trump said he was ending talks over a stimulus package with Democrats, leading to a sharp drop on Wall Street. So let's toss that into the garbage.
No. I'll come back. I think even President Trump is. It's a game of chicken a bit. So.
Another question from the audience?
Yes, sure.
Yeah. Getting back to the root of the approach of the Poverty Action Lab, what I think makes your work so strong, and not just me, also the Nobel Prize Committee, is that you actually went in these randomized trials to look at what happened on the ground. We give people stoves, they don't use them. Why don't they use them? What can we do to improve the distribution and the design of the stoves? I mean, the real nitty-gritty, as Esther said in the beginning. And the question from our audience is, why in the world is this so revolutionary? Isn't this what everyone should be doing who's spending money on helping other people, is see what's really effective? Why is this extraordinary?
It's not. It's what is, I agree. Everybody should be doing it, and increasingly people are. I feel that it's still the power of people's, I know how the world works and it works this way is hard to overestimate. It's people really have enormous confidence. Policymakers have enormous confidence in their own understanding. I'm always amazed by what they say, and sometimes, not all of them, obviously, many of them are very modest and very perceptive, but a bunch of them will also tell you that, I know that this is what we need to do. And when they say that, I'm always a little bit in shock, because I feel like, how did you know? I've been doing this for 20 years and I don't know that.
You yourself, I think, made this. You said, "Well, we work like plumbers. That's what a plumber does." You are trying to repair something and it doesn't work, and you shift it a bit and you try something else. And I was thinking, even people on the market do it. Today, I bring these breads and I see that people only want this type and not that type. So tomorrow, I bring the other ones, and I find out that they like it more if it's not too old. So actually, it's very human to constantly test and do it. It's just probably why policymakers don't do it is because it's on such a big scale, and we need people like you and a proper set of tools to really test it then. But in a way, we're all doing it.
The question is a bit more difficult than the question the guy in the market faces, right? Because he is himself observing how much he sells of every bread. And you're, as a policymaker, trying to improve how schools do.
And you're not in the school.
You're not in the school, and the results come in a couple of years later. And
so we should put economists in schools and on the places where they need to research. That's the idea of the lab?
Yeah, and then there's probably Mr. Banerjee can explain better. And then there's the political economy of the whole thing. So it's that organizations get money to provide some assistance somewhere, and they're not necessarily interested in whether this really works.
Yeah, maybe that's a good last reflection. The economists call it political economy, but the whole incentives why maybe organizations do not end up asking the right questions.
Many of them do, to be fair.
Yeah.
Yes.
We hope that one day more.
If we all read the book and we take your lessons, we cannot ignore it, and we will. Okay, well, thank you so much for being with us tonight. Our best regards and a warm thank you. Also for the people you haven't been seeing, but there's some people here in this theater.
Thank you to everybody.
Thank you so much.
I would also like to thank you, Professor Banerjee, on behalf of the John Adams Institute. Also, many thanks to our moderators, Esther van Rijswijk and Jasper Lukezen. And a huge word of thanks to the Public Library, the OBA. We're in their beautiful facilities here, and we have a warm collaboration with them to work together much more in the future. I hope that you'll join us on our next event, not on Election Day, but the day after. The event will also be called The Day After. We're inviting several speakers who have spoken at the John Adams to join us for short blocks of 15 to 20 minutes to tell us about their impression of the day before and what they think. We don't have the illusion that we'll know yet then what the outcome is, but I think it'll be interesting to reflect with some of the best and the brightest minds of American thinking. Those are the people that we invite, like Professor Banerjee, to reflect on the no doubt momentous events of November 3rd. I also wanted to mention that the book by Banerjee and Duflo is published in Dutch by publishing house Thomas Rapp, as we saw with the title Hoe economie de wereld kan redden. And last thing I would like to ask you is to stay seated, and our volunteers will invite you to leave the hall as we go. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for all of you online for joining us, and hope to see you again on November 4th, the day after.